Welcome to the Afghan Eye YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to a new episode of the Afghan Eye Podcast. My name is Sangar and
Ahmed-Waleed.
In today's episode, our guest is Fatima Ayub, who is a political analyst with more than 2 decades of researching Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Fatima, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, Fatima, we are delighted to have you as our guest to talk about Afghanistan, obviously. But before we do that, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your own personal background. So, where is Fatima from? Where did you grow up? What did you study?
Sure. Yes, of course. So my family left Afghanistan, or my parents left Afghanistan in 1981, and I was eventually born in what was at the time West Germany. And after that, my parents would eventually resettle in the States, and that's by and large where I grew up. And I studied political science and international relations for my undergraduate and graduate studies, and I had a specific focus on international law for my master's. I studied here in the DC area where I live now at George Mason and then John Hopkins University. And just after I finished my master's, I wound up going to Afghanistan for the first time. I was about, I think, 22 or 23 years old. And that was the beginning of my professional engagement with Afghanistan, although obviously, given my family background, my family's history, my grandfather had a very important and special story. The reason my parents originally left Afghanistan was because my grandfather was a staunch anti-communist. He was a journalist. He had served as a minister in Musa Shafiq's cabinet, and then he was imprisoned for 2 years when Hafizullah Amin came. And then even after there's a political amnesty for a lot of political prisoners between the time Hafizullah Amin and Babrak Karmal took power, and my grandfather was released during that amnesty, but then they were just re-arresting the same intelligentsia over again. And it was very clear to my family that they could no longer stay in Afghanistan, and everyone started to leave in pieces. And some of my family stayed, some left during the Civil War. The constant reminder about life in Afghanistan has always been there, irrespective of whether I was working on it personally. But I think it's just, for me at least, being Afghan has shaped the choices I made for my career. And the fact that I spent a big chunk of my career specifically focused on human rights issues and how to prevent human rights violations. Because in Afghanistan, we really have seen the worst of everything. So, I think that gives you a good picture of who I am and what motivates me and so on.
Yes, thank you. So you have a personal background where you have actually experienced it through your grandfather, the persecution. And when you started studying political science, at that time, I'm sure it was around the start of the new millennium. Did you think that you will end up dedicating the rest of your life researching Afghanistan?
No, I didn't at the time. And I have to be honest, I don't even consider myself now to have dedicated my life to Afghanistan. I think in as difficult and horrible as the experience of my parents' generation was, my generation turned out lucky. Our family ended up somewhere safe. We had the ability to grow up without any problems and to become educated, and then hopefully to be a productive part of human society. But as the longer the war in Afghanistan went on, it became harder and harder to leave. And so I think not just the turn of the millennium, I started university in the year 2000. 9/11 happened in 2001. And so all of my political understanding or sort of outlook in a way as an adult has been shaped by how the US has been conducting itself in Afghanistan, right? That's the entirety of my adult life. So no, I actually didn't think that I would have dedicated my whole life to Afghanistan. Now, once I went to Afghanistan, I started to feel like there were several lifetimes of work to be done there. Even if everyone in the country was being productive, and if there wasn't a war, there are generations of work to do in Afghanistan. But what happened, I found, is I would say around 2012, I took a break from working on Afghanistan professionally from around 2014. And the reason for that was I had essentially lost hope in any kind of U-turn in Afghanistan. I had worked very hard as part of my time at the Open Society Foundations, which, as you know, is a major global philanthropy that focuses on civil and political freedoms. We were a coalition of organizations that lobbied very hard to try and change the direction of US and European foreign policy in Afghanistan. It was a total failure. Absolutely no one was interested in a conversation about rethinking Afghanistan's politics and reconsidering the choices that had been made in the last 10 years and why we find ourselves in the situation that we're in. And it took another 10 years for anyone to be prepared to have that conversation. So I think at about 2014, I personally didn't have a sense of vision for what could be useful for Afghanistan going forward.
And you said that it was a total failure to change minds of political leaders in the United States and Europe. What is, in your opinion, the reason why they were not prepared to listen to a different view or different perspective?
Oh, that's a very complicated question, but I think perhaps the simplest way to put it is I think governments in Europe and in the US were very willing to lie to themselves about their purpose and strategy, or their lack of a strategy in Afghanistan, and what progress exactly they were making. I'm sure you've all heard it. We've constantly heard it. Afghanistan is making progress. It's about to turn a corner. I mean, we've heard it so much that I just want to scream every time someone said it, right? Because it was absolutely not true. If you actually looked at the metrics in terms of the amount of fighting, the amount of civilians being killed year on year, things were getting worse, right? And I found that there was a real, almost collective denial about how poorly things were going in Afghanistan. And I started working there in 2006, right? Even in 2006, it was very clear that things were already in a bad place because of the way the international forces were conducting themselves, because of the way the new Afghan government was conducting itself. It became clear that public discontent in Afghanistan was going to become a driver of the insurgency. It was going to keep growing and keep mounting. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. What is the reason why there are clear indications that there is very little progress being made in the last 2 decades? And yeah, what is, in your opinion, the reason why people still continue saying, look, we have made so much progress?
Well, I think people need some justification for the $1 trillion they spent in the last 20 years, honestly. I think there is a more problematic layer to this, which is an attitude of Western countries coming to Afghanistan to help. And I think it's very hard even today to disabuse donor organizations foreign ministries, the big development organizations, that actually a lot of what they did in Afghanistan was harmful, that it that the choices they thought they were making wound up empowering the wrong people, enriching the wrong people, and creating an environment where the Taliban movement has really been able to capitalize on people's anger with corruption or injustice or anything they perceive that the government is doing wrong, right? So I think it was, no one wanted to accept the reality that they did not really know what was best for Afghanistan, right? And I, to this day, I find myself wondering a great deal about all the people who turned up in Afghanistan after 2001 from the international organizations and the aid agencies and the diplomats and everyone else. I mean, it's very clear to me why I want to work in Afghanistan. It's very unclear to me what someone who isn't Afghan wants to do in Afghanistan, or what they think they can offer. And I appreciate that some of it was well-intentioned. But I also think that a great deal of both the political and the development processes that were in place were very ignorant. I don't think people understood Afghanistan. I think people underestimated the difficulty or the depth of difficulty in a place like Afghanistan, because Afghanistan had already had 20 very bad years before the US even arrived. I think there was this very easy, there was a thought, I think, in the US in particular, that this was an easy war, that once they had actually removed the Taliban from power, which didn't take very long, well, there couldn't possibly be anything else to do here, right? Here we go, we'll have a new government, we'll have elections, here's a parliament, appoint some governors, here you go. You got a country, go do it. But as we know, it's not like build a country. You can't just buy a kit and put it together. Afghanistan hadn't recovered from the civil war. The tensions and anger and problems that had fueled the civil war were still there, and in many ways are still there. And all the current war, the last 20 years of war, did was sort of exacerbate and deepen the divides that already existed, and it made them harder to resolve, actually. So yeah, I think a great deal of this insistence that everything is going well was just ignorance. I mean, I invite you to recall, I'm not sure how old you guys are, but
I'm about same age as you are.
Okay. So I don't
26.
know if you remember, okay, you're quite young, so maybe you won't remember, but the US kept sending there's a succession of brilliant generals to Afghanistan, right? It was like Stanley McChrystal turned up at some point.
I remember that.
And Stanley McChrystal was supposed to be the genius of counterinsurgency. Like, he had a plan for Afghanistan and it was going to work. But of course, it was garbage and nonsense. I was telling Sangar the other day that I'm very angry about Afghanistan. And the reason I'm so angry is because every ignorant idiot who turned up with half of an idea in Afghanistan managed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars on what? On what? What did you achieve? And then after McChrystal, we had another genius, David Petraeus, who everyone in Washington was calling a warrior philosopher. Like, enjoy that. Just enjoy that phrase for a minute. Yeah. A warrior philosopher. David Petraeus did nothing to change the course of the war. There's a lot of arrogance in the belief of what the U.S. military can achieve. I think even now probably, but certainly at the time.
I mean, if you look at the attitude of the international community, the word arrogance really does sort of make sense of why their strategic calculus was missing, because at the time, like right now, we've got this whole I'm sure you're aware of it, this debate of centralization versus decentralization, right? And it's sort of become internationalized, and you're sort of thinking, why is the international community talking about decentralization, right? But if we assume that the first model was super centralized, we're now at the level where we're looking at the international community. It's like you said, it's not a toolkit you put together. Here are your governors. There's Gul Agha Shirzai. Inshallah, everything is going to work out, and boom, it's done. But then it was, okay, let's go and invade it. Okay, let's go and occupy it. Okay, let's say 90,000 troops didn't work. Okay, let's try another 30,000 troops. Maybe that'll work. Okay, that doesn't work. Let's get, like you said, the warrior philosophers in, and now let's get decentralization in. What I think is missing all along is the actual input of Afghans, or rather, in sort of non-affiliated Afghans that aren't aligned, that don't just parrot what the international community wants them to say. What would you say was missing in sort of other than humility? What else would you say were the key ingredients that were missing in their sort of strategic calculus?
I mean, on my most critical days, I'm going to say that this was a war that lacked morality, insofar as the US was willing to partner and ally with some really ugly personalities in Afghanistan in order to make the post-2001 transition work. And I mean really ugly things. We're talking about mass killing, ethnic cleansing, rape, pillage. I mean, everyone should know, even though a lot of people still pretend ignorance, Afghans as well, about what Afghan factions have done to each other and the Afghan people. I mean, it's still not an honest conversation, right? Even now when I watch Twitter sometimes, and there's like people who are willing to idolize Hekmatyar, and they're the people who want to idolize Dostum, and here, I'm like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. We've learned nothing. We've learned absolutely nothing. And I think, to your point, I think there was a very deliberate effort in 2001 when the UN and other governments were looking to put together the Bonn Conference, as you recall, which was supposed to kind of frame Afghanistan's transitional government. There was a pretty deliberate effort to kind of work with the most powerful, but consequently most problematic Afghans and leave everyone else on the margins. And that was it. That was really, I think, that's where the story started to go wrong, right? Because I just don't understand. If you're going to build a government on the back of war criminals, why are you surprised that Afghanistan looks the way it does today?
That's a very good question. That, like, this is the most essential thing that needs to be said. Like, when I say that, sometimes I say, look, everything that has gone wrong, it has gone wrong because from the outset, the ingredients were a formula for disaster. So it's not like you can make a great civil, Cheryl Bernard, Khalilzad's wife, she wrote that infamous policy paper, I think in 2004, building civil democratic Afghanistan. Every time when I think of that, like civil democratic Afghanistan, human rights, blah, 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 and then what are the ingredients? Torturers, mass murderers, thieves, looters. Suddenly, because the Americans are there, because the Europeans are there, these guys, they are going to just put on a tie and stop killing, looting, and suddenly respect human rights. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So it's in my opinion, it's like, as long as we can't actually accept that that's what happened 20 years ago, we can't solve most of our current problems. But yeah, enough of my usual rants. But Fatima, so it's very interesting that you made these observations during the course of many years that you have been researching Afghanistan. We are currently seeing that there's a lot of new analysts and new commentators, and they're all commenting about Afghanistan, the current peace process. Obviously, there is a lot being published because Afghanistan is now center of international media attention.
Once again.
Yeah. And in your opinion, what is wrong with what is currently mainly being said about Afghanistan? Especially,
wow.
no. To be very specific, like
Yeah.
the peace process, the way it's going forward, and the withdrawal of foreign forces. There's a lot of being said from the American side, obviously, but there are also academics and researchers and commentators. They're all giving their views and opinions. But do you think that there is something like inherently missing and wrong about the way the whole situation is being described and analyzed?
Yes, there are a few things. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that the reality is that the U.S. lost this war, right? If the goal was to remove the Taliban from power and ensure they don't come back, well, that's a failed goal. So, and there's not nearly enough acknowledgement of how the U.S. lost the war in Afghanistan. I don't think there's nearly enough reflection about that. I don't think there's nearly enough understanding that this war that was supposedly about the U.S. and Al-Qaeda was fought on the backs of Afghans for 20 years. And that has it took an enormous toll on several new generations. I don't think there's any acknowledgement of that. I don't think that there's any systematic lessons learned about how do you actually fight violent non-state armed groups in the world. I don't think that because the reason I say that is because we've seen a repetition of the stupid things that the U.S. did in Afghanistan and places like the Sahel in Africa, where you have many, many deep political and social problems. But the only angle that countries like France and the U.S. will use to understand the region is militancy. So I think, I think when I listen to the way people talk about Afghanistan now, a lot of it feels like they haven't actually learned anything. And I think that's the thing that makes me angriest.
Sure. Do you also see any voice of reason in the current, like if you watch on daily basis, there are new reports coming out. There are new ideas being promoted about how to go forward from now on. And are there any new voices of reason? Like, is there any decent analysis and decent commentary that you say, okay, I am glad that after 20 years now we hear this or we hear that?
No, I don't think I'm hearing any particularly profound analysis. The voices that I'm interested in hearing at this point are Afghans who have had enough of all sides of the political class, because those Afghans exist, right? There are plenty of Afghans who are pissed off with everyone. And there has to be and I'm always quite conscious that I don't want to speak over the voices of people who have to live in Afghanistan, because my reality is very different from their reality. What they have to contend with, what they have to do to survive, how they choose to live their lives. Like I shouldn't speak over that, right? But I'm struggling to see so far where the next kind of movement or vision for Afghanistan is going to come from. Because I think what's problematic is that everyone is, I think most analysts are willing to agree that Afghanistan is heading for another civil war. And that's another thing. And the analysis there is also incredibly shallow, because it in no way reflects on how the conditions of the war over the last 20 years have brought us into a point where a civil war is almost guaranteed. And also that it was not inevitable. I don't think that Afghanistan had to come to this. Uh, so yeah, I think what's missing in Afghanistan is a vision by people who are not compromised by their affiliation with kind of the US-backed governments, or aren't tarnished by their affiliation with the Taliban, who can sit down and think about what kind of future they want to see and how can they build. Because I want you eventually, right? You and I and others, and presumably the people in Afghanistan, they want a government that's going to work for them and represent them. Um, and that's where I just feel like there's still to this day not enough attention being paid to that, and the way that politics works in Afghanistan to this day is about your network of personal loyalties and allegiances, and you'll stick by your preferred ethnic leader or whichever faction leader you were supporting 20 years ago, or no, you're upset with this faction, so you're going to join this faction. But articulating a policy agenda, a vision for fixing what is one of the poorest countries on earth. I mean, where are those people who are going to lead Afghanistan out of this mess? I want to hear from those people.
And what is the reason? Obviously, we know that people who are not aligned with either one or the other groups, that they exist. Obviously, in Afghanistan they exist, but also in the diaspora. So, what is, in your opinion, the reason why the non-aligned people are silent?
I think first of all, the main reason is that the way that the conversation about the war in Afghanistan was shaped at the very beginning was that you're either with us or against us. This is a good war or a bad war. The Taliban are bad, we're good. The new government is good, everyone else is bad. There were these very lazy, I think, ideas or beliefs that people embrace. I mean, the notion, for example, that invading a country in order to liberate its women was even a serious sentence, that the notion that anyone could say that or think it and not have it come across as completely crazy. I mean, but that's it. That was a serious, straight-faced argument that people would make across the whole world, Afghans included. And so I think for Afghans who found themselves in a position of, well, I definitely don't want another war in Afghanistan, but I also think the Taliban were kind of horrible. All the factional leaders from the 90s are total junk. I'm not interested in seeing any of those people in power. So what's next, right? And there was never really a process to include or incorporate the views of the diaspora into what was happening in Afghanistan. And I think it's a real waste, because I knew a lot of young Afghans like myself who, after 2001, you're like, okay, we're going to make the most of it. Let's try and see what we can contribute to Afghanistan. And that was the reason tens of thousands of young Afghans went back to Afghanistan. Most of them left. I mean, a lot of them stayed to keep making money because, everyone realized it was a racket at some point. But for the people who went because they were dedicated to, I don't know, kind of rebuilding or social justice issues or political justice issues or human rights, a lot of these people became really disillusioned. And that was certainly true for me. So I don't know that there's never really been an effort for Afghans to pull themselves together. And I think this would be an interesting moment for Afghans to try and do that. But to say that, we have kind of important links to this country and we want to have a voice in what happens to it going forward. But I mean, no one is making that case now, I don't think.
Sure. I miss in current environment. I miss a sort of organizing attempts. I don't see that Afghans in the diaspora, that they are trying to join forces and cooperate with one another. And I think that it's partially because we have been so damaged as a society and so divided on political, ethnic, religious grounds, that there is a lot of distrust. And in my opinion, distrust among Afghans in the diaspora is also one of the reasons why there is no cooperation. It's like we are very suspicious of one another. I notice that often because I've been very involved with all sorts of organizations here in the Netherlands, with among Afghans, and I see that there is a lot of distrust. But I also notice that people tend to get like into small bubbles of people who are either from the same ethnic background or they have a same family relations on political grounds, and it's very disappointing. It's very sad, obviously, because you see so much potential. We see young Afghans who are very bright, very well educated. They have benefited from all the abilities, all the opportunities in Western countries, but somehow we are still stuck in the same tracks as our parents, and it's very difficult to liberate ourselves from the same tracks. And in my opinion, that's what's causing the fact that the people in the diaspora are either silent or very poorly organized, or they can't seem to make a dent. It's just very fractured and very divided. But what do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. I think because Afghanistan has been fractured in so many ways for so long, it's not unnatural that people tend to fall into the groups that they're comfortable with. And that's obviously a legacy of the Civil War, but it's also a huge legacy of the communist period. I don't know about you guys, but I don't ever want to look a communist in the eye. I don't ever want to talk to one. I don't want to spend time with one. I don't want any excuses about communism. I don't want to hear about how communism is fine. It's just no one has implemented it right. I just don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it, right? I absolutely never want to, and I don't want forgiveness. I don't want to offer forgiveness to these people. But the thing is, and this is one of the, this is unfortunately one of the saddest legacies of Afghanistan, is there has never been accountability for what's happened in Afghanistan. No one has ever been accountable for what they've done in Afghanistan. And when you have no accountability, people basically behave however they want.
Exactly.
And, the communists acted with total impunity because they thought that they had absolute power. And now you want to talk about how the Afghan intelligence services conduct themselves, or how the U.S. has behaved over in its time in Afghanistan. I mean, it's no one. The notion that a group of U.S. Special Forces can go to Jalalabad at night, break into my family's home, kill 8 people, say it was an accident, and then that's it. That's the whole story. That is the whole story of what happens, right?
That's what actually happened to your relatives.
That's what actually happened. My mother's family is originally from Jalalabad. They still have land there. And our family, my extended cousins and relatives, still live there.
Yes.
Or they lived there. A few years after this event, they basically decided to sell the land and leave because Jalalabad had become so unsafe. But that's a separate conversation. Look, all I'm saying is Afghans have trouble looking each other in the eye and acknowledging what they've done to each other. And you have to build processes where people can do that. And there's a whole formal study of this, called Transitional Justice, where you study how you take a society that's had a serious conflict or serious human rights abuses, and you try to move it to a place where you prevent those abuses from happening again, and you hold accountable the people who committed them. And we saw processes like this after World War II. We saw them in Cambodia, in Rwanda, sort of, various international courts, tribunals, etc. Or even in the case of South Africa, where you had truth commissions, where at least the truth of what came out of apartheid, the system of apartheid, what people witnessed, what white South Africans had participated in, and what they'd done and the crimes they'd committed. You need a national reckoning in Afghanistan. And the diaspora has an important role to play, and part of that role is keeping people who call themselves leaders accountable.
This reminds me of something I think you may recall when Farouk Wardak was the Minister of Education. Around that time, there was a plan to scrap recent history of Afghanistan from all books in order to create an environment of national reconciliation and forgiveness. So what the communists and all these other jihadi factions have done before 2001, that was supposed to be all scrapped so that future generations don't know what kind of horrible crimes were committed against Afghan people by fellow Afghans. And it was like very like hallucinating. It was like I was hallucinating when I saw that. Like, how can you even think about that? Who in their right mind can come up with an idea like that? Obviously, the criminals, the people who have actually done horrible things to their own people, they come up with this idea. You know what? We're going to just forget everything. And that's a major problem, because here in the Netherlands, most Afghans that I know are either Khalqi or Parchami. And it's very difficult for me to have a bond with fellow Afghans in this country, because I am also, my parents were also communists. And I have this attitude where I'm saying, okay, what their regime, what their government has done is wrong. And there are factual evidence that they have done horrible things. But somehow it is very difficult to have this honest conversation, sitting across the table, having a coffee with another Afghan and saying, look, that's what basically happened. And they say, but no, it was necessary, it was necessary because these savage mujahideen, they were doing this and that. And I, like, what are you talking about? There were no savage mujahideen when the revolution happened, and those horrible things that happened, it wasn't because people benefit from it. And they say, yes, but in Kabul, we used to live in Mikroyan Char, we had a flat, we used to go to school. Yeah, sure, you did, I did, but the rest of the country didn't. The rest of the country had to suffer. So if we have honest conversations about what happened then, maybe we can also start having honest conversations about what's happening now. Because
absolutely,
like what you sort of alluded to previously, when we say that there is progress, when there is so much progress since 2001, the metrics that are being used, especially in the media, in political speeches, they're very superficial. Like the fact that in Afghanistan, poverty is still rife, and inequality has grown exponentially. That's one of the things that is not being addressed. Like, if you have still over 1 million beggars in the streets of Kabul, but a few high-risers, it doesn't mean that there's progress. That's not progress. It means that wealth creates even more poverty, and if that is not being acknowledged, then how can we say we should move onwards and move past what happened in our recent history? what is currently happening is not being acknowledged. What is right now happening, people who live in Kabul, like my relatives, they're in constant fear. They're in constant fear because they may lose their job. And if you lose your job, it means you have absolutely nothing, no support, nothing. For people in Western countries, maybe it's very difficult to imagine. Here in these countries, if you lose your job, there is social security and whatnot. But in Afghanistan, none of that exists.
No, it's all, like you say, it's very difficult to imagine. I said earlier, like, Afghanistan needs a period of national reckoning. There has to be a national collective acknowledgement of responsibility of what's happened in Afghanistan. And that's fine. I mean, I don't have any expectation that someone is going to hold Russia accountable for what it did in Afghanistan. I don't expect that anyone's going to hold the US accountable for what it did in Afghanistan. But I actually do expect Afghans to hold each other accountable. And I think it's important to have conversations like this. It's really, I think it's very difficult to be outside Afghanistan and to know that there's still a period of extended suffering before people, I think, are even willing to start having this conversation. I mean, just this morning, I don't know if you saw the news about the bombing in Dasht-e-Bachi.
Yes.
Just a bomb in front of a school, kill some school kids. It's casual. It's so casual. Death and violence are so casual in Afghanistan that, first of all, you need an end to that, right? And so I think I think you asked earlier about what I think has been missing from the analysis in the last year is that when the U.S. made its agreement with the Taliban in Doha, that was a withdrawal agreement for the U.S. It wasn't a peace agreement. It was basically an agreement that the Taliban would stop attacking U.S. forces and that the U.S. would prepare for withdrawal. It wasn't a peace agreement in any meaningful term. It was supposed to be accompanied by a reduction in violence. There's been no reduction in violence in Afghanistan. And as we know from the numbers, it's only gotten worse.
You said something is interesting with regards to the attack today is people are desensitized to most horrific crimes that are happening. Like for us, the impact is very big. Like when you see something like 3 bombs targeting a school where most of the students are young girls. If it would happen somewhere else in the world, it would be shocking. It would be in the headlines. Michelle Obama would start campaigning about it. But because it's in Afghanistan, it's like, But sadly, our own people are also desensitized, and that's something that really bothers me because we should feel some kind of we should have the morality, the humanity to say that these horrible things need to stop. But I want to go back to what you said earlier. You said that there needs to be a process of acknowledgement and acceptance that, that we look each other in the eye. But you also said you don't want to look a communist in the eye. So, okay.
Well, I know. The thing is, but I have, right? When I worked in Afghanistan, I had to work with all kinds of people who were formerly communists and people who could and did acknowledge that there was the trouble with communism and the mistakes that were made at the time. And the thing is, I may hate communists and communism, right? But I have no interest in limiting the rights or freedoms of anyone who pretends to be a communist. The trouble is communists don't believe in rights and freedoms for other people. That tends to be the issue, unfortunately. But it's true. I think Afghans have to acknowledge and but I think the process of sort of forgiveness and dealing with the past needs truth. I mean, there has to be some measure of truth. And like certainly the last 20 years of Afghanistan, And the war and the history of the war have largely been a lie. The story that we tell about this war has been a lie. And yeah, and as you say, Afghanistan already has monumental challenges. The poverty rate is rising even before COVID, right? Like that's why no one is exactly sure how the COVID shock, other than the fact that unemployment is skyrocketing and poverty is skyrocketing. But one of the most depressing things I heard recently was I was researching a report for the UN about human rights conditions in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And when you speak to humanitarian and development officials, they tell you countries like Afghanistan tend to move from a humanitarian crisis into an era of sustainable development. Afghanistan has slipped backward from development into humanitarian crisis. After 20 years of people pumping money into Afghanistan, supposedly, it's still a country in humanitarian crisis. Look at, the enormity of the challenges Afghanistan faces. You're going to feed people first, or are you going to get them to acknowledge their history, right? There has to be a priority setting process.
I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of the times I feel like we're just, in terms of the national reckoning and sort of everyone or every faction acknowledging that they've committed unspeakable horror against other Afghans. On that front, I actually feel like for some reason we're going backwards because the trajectory of our society and our country is such that it keeps going from bad to worse. Okay. Yes. So, and when we keep going from bad to worse, inevitably there's something now that is missing that used to exist. You see this, we're speaking about communism, we see this with this revival of a romanticism for Dr. Najib, right? Because back then we had a leader who knew he was a fair, he was a good orator. I've heard a lot of people say, who looked like a leader who wouldn't embarrass us on a national scale. They mean generally someone who didn't wear a turban or didn't have a beard. This is a real competent leader. And then before that, we've sort of got, Sangar and I did a podcast. One of our listeners requested a podcast on Dawood Khan, and the older generation are guilty of romanticizing this nostalgia for Dawood Khan. Until, you spoke about your grandfather, Musa Shafiq, and whatever. Well, who imprisoned Musa Shafiq? Under who was it that the former Prime Minister Ayub was killed in custody? It was Dawood Khan, right? And so then we've got, for example, people with nostalgia for the Taliban government because, if anything, at least we had security back then. Now we don't even have security. And so on and so forth it goes. And we're in this constant sort of vicious cycle, this bottomless abyss or pit of nostalgia going back, where we need to sort of realize, look, Dr. Najib, the whole hard, this is going to be a really simplistic way of putting it, that whole hard thing that he had going on for 6 years, that wasn't cool, right? Dawood Khan allying with communists, overthrowing a constitutional period in our history that now when we look back at it, we're like, at least once again, I'm falling into the same thing. We're like, okay, at least we had a constitution, we had parliament, we had representatives of the people. Dawood Khan overthrowing that wasn't cool, right? The Taliban going around hanging cassettes off tree branches, it wasn't cool. I mean, I'm not personally a cassette fan, but hanging televisions or whatever, kites, whatever the hell it was, there needs to be sort of a baseline that we establish. And we're like, look, these are sort of inviolable tenets of what a government and society in Afghanistan should function like and operate. And we've lost that. And like you said, 20 kids just died in West Kabul. All right, yeah, it's sad news, but if it was somewhere else in the world, the country would be up in arms. But we're sort of sensitized, and I think sort of acknowledging that we need to come out of that sort of abyss. Like I said, I started ranting about it and I fell into it myself, right? That is probably the most challenging thing for sort of the national social psyche.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that it is, to be fair, it's very hard to stay optimistic or generate new visions when you're kind of constantly going from crisis to conflict, I think that's probably one of the major issues. And I think for my own part, I'm just saying I increasingly care less and less about what people outside Afghanistan have to say about Afghanistan. I want to know how Afghans in the diaspora, I think some of the questions you guys are asking, how can Afghans like the first thing I want to see in Afghanistan, and I want it like today, I don't want it tomorrow, I wanted it yesterday, I want a ceasefire. I want a national ceasefire. Like the fact that it's absolutely true that peace processes can happen when there's ongoing violence, and they do. It happens all the time. But unfortunately, you usually, you want some measure of reduction in violence to demonstrate good faith. If you can't reduce violence, to me, it suggests that you are not negotiating in good faith. And I think that's my core criticism of the negotiations as they're going on right now, because as you say, the fact that 25 children were murdered at school this morning shouldn't be casual. We should really be, it happens at intervals. Remember when there was the attack on the maternity hospital in Kabul? It's like, well, today we shot some babies. Great. But this is it. This is the attitude we have now. I would like us to stop killing babies, school children, and then maybe we can go from there. But I actually don't know where the bottom is for the violence. I genuinely don't know.
It is a very depressing situation that we have described so far. But
yeah,
okay, but you have brought this up, and Waleed has sort of agreed with you, and I agree as well. But let's just try to. Okay, so you said we need to have a process where we acknowledge what has happened. Okay, I fully agree with what you say, but do you have a plan? Do you have a suggestion how to do that?
Well, okay, let me tell you what I was doing before in Afghanistan, because it was exactly about this kind of thing. I worked for an organization called the International Center for Transitional Justice, which had been founded by people who had been part of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And basically, they were trying to learn lessons about how you rebuild trust and safety in societies that have undergone these vast traumas, right? Apartheid lasted for decades. It did deep damage to South Africa, and it came on the back of centuries of colonialism. So in Afghanistan, there was a small fledgling effort to start addressing some of these questions. And the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission had a mandate to investigate all of the serious crimes that had happened in Afghanistan from 1978 to 2001. And that research became the subject of a very, very problematic political football in Afghanistan, because the international, various sort of third countries wanted nothing to do with it. Certain governments, for example, we received funding from the Dutch government and the Swedish government to undertake research, to work with Afghan NGOs about small-scale efforts to initiate dialogues about what's happened in Afghanistan and how we move beyond the point where we sit. But just the act of commissioning a report about the crimes that had taken place in Afghanistan between 1978 and 2001 caused such enormous controversy that at the time, I think this was in 2008, the Afghan parliament ultimately passed an amnesty law for everyone who had been involved in anything at any point before 2001. And that was largely where the official conversation about justice and memory and reconciliation died. And I don't think there has been any formal effort to keep it going ever since. But usually, these kinds of processes are major international efforts. They have the backing of the UN and the Security Council. There's an actual timeline for it. There will frequently be mediators or specialists or experts appointed to help with the process. Afghanistan never had that, and it was very deliberate because the US made the choice to re-empower a certain set of political actors. No one wanted to have a conversation about accountability or memory or who did what. because the conversation was just at that point. It's like it was just about the Taliban. The Taliban are the bad guys. Everyone else is good. The Taliban are bad.
I mean,
So yes, yeah.
you just reminded me of sorry to cut. You know, we were
That's
talking
right.
about the progress narrative, right? Here
Yeah.
we have, let's say, the Afghan parliament, which is the supposed sort of materialization of the Afghan people's exercise of their
Mhm.
democratic will, and that's the kind of stuff that they're doing, or they were doing. You know, basically carte blanche for warlords of every stripe. So
Right.
once again, like just that example shows how much of this, like the rescuing women thing, like the progress thing, like the gains of the last 19 or 20 or however many years it's been, how much of that narrative is shallow, because a lot of the times if you just prod a little deeper, you see how heavily involved in certain, you know, unpalatable realities these sort of actors or institutions are involved in.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. I think every aspect of the war in Afghanistan. I mean, people have already been writing books about it, but people will write many more books about how just these concepts around aid and development, right, which we consider sometimes neutral, like helping people with money. What's bad about that? But those are very political decisions. And the choices we make in aid and development shape the politics of those countries. In the case of Afghanistan, it created a war economy because there was so much money and so many unaccountable actors that so for example, I mean, I'll never forget, I'll tell you one of the stories that just blew my mind. When Ahmed-Waleed Karzai was head of the provincial council in Kandahar, the preferred method of the time for the Taliban insurgents who were fighting in the area was to booby trap houses and villages. And then when Afghan or international forces entered, the houses would explode. But obviously, this was really bad for the civilian population. And finally, the coalition forces decided they'd had enough of this. So they ordered all the villagers to leave, okay? And I think this was in the Arrogance. I don't remember exactly where it was. I have to go back and check. But anyway, they cleared out all the villagers. And they're like, we're going to build you a new village. You're going to have a new village over there, okay? But this village, we're destroying it. So they flatten it. They destroy it because all the houses are booby-trapped and they don't want to go in there. But all the contracts and the deeds for the land in this new village had to be approved by Ahmed-Waleed Karzai. So who do you think got the building contracts? Who do you think got sort of all of the construction contracts, the security contracts? And who do you think actually got deeds for new land? Well, people who were loyal to Ahmed-Waleed Karzai. And this is how aid and development money was spent in Afghanistan. I mean, the whole country is just completely rife with these examples. USAID, the US's own development agency, is under criminal investigation for the development fraud it perpetrated in Afghanistan, specifically in the education sector, because there are at least 500 schools that USAID said it built that simply don't exist. Right?
You know, I have relatives who work for these organizations, and they told me that the American guy who was representing this organization came up to me with a plan. Look, let's do this, that, and then we will defraud the institution with so much money, and then we can share it 50-50. So the international organizations were supposed to provide aid. Their own employers were encouraging corruption. But anyway, so what you described about, how people were told to leave their villages and the whole village was bombed, that's something that has happened repeatedly in the last 40 years. During the communists, when the Russians, when they realized that they cannot hold the rural areas, their strategy was to just bomb rural areas and force everyone to go to the cities because they could control the cities. This is very well documented. It appears in many books and many reports about the 1980s. But similar things have happened in Afghanistan since 2001. entire villages. Like in the northern parts of Afghanistan, people were entire villages were forced to flee because the village was considered, okay, you are Pashtun, so you used to be loyal to Taliban, so therefore you deserve this. But when we talk about stories like that, it has a very strong element of, it's very sensitive, because obviously when you bring this up, people will say, okay, so now you are accusing everybody else of doing that. What about this and what about that? So the conversation very swiftly shifts to whataboutism. And this is something that I struggle with a lot. I see this often. I'm very outspoken. I'm very blunt. But if I say something, then the first reaction is, but what about this or what about that? How can we overcome that? What do we need to do if we are trying to have some sort of acknowledgement or whatever, that people stop constantly saying, yes, but what about this or what about that?
I think everyone would just benefit from some humility in these conversations. And the reason I say that is because, Waleed, as you were saying, if we dig deep enough, there are serious problems everywhere you look, whether it's in Afghanistan or in other societies. I think when I say we need to have humility, I think we have to acknowledge that other people have suffering, that other people have witnessed trauma that may not look like our trauma, and that part of the reason we fall into whataboutery, as you said, is because I think people don't feel acknowledged. People don't feel like their experiences have been seen or validated or understood. And so it becomes a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's like my reaction to communists is very knee-jerk, right? Like, nope, communism, nope, we're not doing that. But that's because if someone somewhere had just said, if collectively agreed, yes, what the communists did to Afghanistan was unacceptable, maybe I would be less upset at communists. Or if former communists in Afghanistan had been like, you know what, my bad. Just say my bad. I don't even want you to say anything else. Like, no one's going to jail. No one's going to hold you accountable. Just say it was wrong. And again, I think it's this honest attitude about what's happened in our history that I think would help solve some of these issues.
Okay, great. So the next question is, let's move on to more current and practical issues. As you know, after the Doha Agreement, the Afghan peace process, to be more specific, then intra-Afghan negotiations were supposed to start. Right. They sort of started in September, but we still see no results. Now, international community, the United States, Qatar, Russia, all these major players, they have suggested that there should be a conference in Istanbul where the leaders of the current government in Afghanistan and the Taliban attend. But that conference was postponed twice. Now there is a lot of uncertainty whether this conference will happen. I would ask you, based on your own research and studying Afghanistan, what is exactly at stake in this conference? Like, what do you think that they're trying to achieve?
Oh, okay. So I think that there are a few different factors at play right now. The first is, I think that the Taliban are going to test their strength against the Afghan National Security Forces. I think they're prepared for that fight. They already think they're winning that fight. And so they want to see how much they can keep capturing militarily without making any political concessions. I think they feel like they have the upper hand on the battlefield. But more importantly, they have the upper hand politically. Again, they won the war and they want to dictate the terms of victory, which I think is a reasonable conclusion if you're the Taliban. However, I think the Taliban will also, I think that there was a hope, right? I think that the US hope was that the Taliban leadership would be folded into existing Afghan government structures, and basically the structure of the current constitution would be maintained. I don't think that the Taliban will settle for that. I think that they would look to rewrite the constitution. And I think, look, I don't think that the Taliban are negotiating in good faith at this point. I don't think the Afghan government's negotiating in good faith, but they have no reason to negotiate at all. They're negotiating themselves out of existence, and they're on the back foot because they lost they're losing their international backers, right? So, but at the end of the day, all of those people are still Afghan. They're still going to have to live in Afghan society and be a part of Afghan society. And I would like that to happen without a great deal more bloodshed. There's a lot at stake about political negotiations, but honestly, I'm not convinced that the Taliban are ready to make concessions that would sustain the current structure of the government as it exists. And I think it's very, I think the current factions that compose the Afghan government are in no way interested in, they might be interested in sharing power, some of their power, but they're in no way willing to give it up. And now I think we see that the Taliban political leadership is adopting a kind of divide and conquer strategy, approaching Abdullah separately, trying to kind of make side deals with other groups. And in this way, they will keep stripping support away from the central government. I honestly think that the Taliban think that they can do this, that they can win this on their terms, irrespective of whether the negotiations play out or not.
Do you think the international community leveraging things like aid, sort of recognition, or the lack of it, so the fact that if the Taliban were to constitute the next government, that they'd be once again a pariah state, do you think those kinds of things are meaningful deterrents for the Taliban?
I think the most meaningful thing you bring up is this issue of international legitimacy, right? I think that this is the reason why the Taliban engaged with the Americans to begin with. But I also think they're willing to forego it if they can't hold power on their terms. I think that they're willing to forego the idea of having international credibility. I mean, they have a much bigger problem, frankly, which is that they need credibility with Afghans. But I think it's like sort of pushed between the two. I'd be willing to bet that they would do, and I don't think aid is a useful leveraging point. No, I think that they've put their money on the fact that the US will keep pumping money into the Afghan security forces for at least a couple of years. I think that they're betting on that fact. And so consequently, they're willing to keep fighting it out for that long. And no, because I think there is a sense that, again, there is a sense globally that America is a diminishing power. The US doesn't recognize you, Europe doesn't recognize you, China recognizes you, India recognizes you. Does it really matter? Russia recognizes you. And that it's a dangerous fault line, right? Because countries that have that attitude usually don't kind of come out very healthy in the end. So all of what I'm trying to say is, should there be pressure on both sides, the Afghan government side and the Taliban, to engage seriously for the purposes of ending the war permanently in Afghanistan and addressing its root causes? Are they willing to have that conversation? I don't think they are.
I think you raised a really good point as well. It's sort of, I said similar to something that I said in a podcast with Lindsay Billing, I think it was, that the Taliban are sort of negotiating their victory, whereas the Afghan government is negotiating its survival, or, like you said, negotiating itself out of existence. And I think that that's why this decision by the Biden administration to just sort of, I was speaking to, so I wrote an article a couple of days ago where I said by extending this deadline unilaterally, and it does seem to be unilateral because all of the indicators are there, because violence has suddenly surged, and the Taliban are sort of advancing throughout Afghanistan. And someone was like to me, oh, and this is someone that was quite writes articles, very literate in Afghan affairs. Is like, oh yes, but there was a lot of pressure against the withdrawal that Biden had to come. And I was like, yeah, but what Biden has done right now is he's neither satisfied that camp because he said, I'm still withdrawing, and at the same time, he's broken an agreement that was signed in the presence of international observers. And like you said, the US does seem to be a diminishing power. It also seems to be a very erratic and unstable power, because every country with which it signs a treaty, whether it be Iran or whether it be a non-state actor like the Taliban, the next administration comes and basically makes all hitherto agreements null and void. And so this was, we're talking about the Istanbul conference. I'm personally, I was always very well aware of the problems of the Afghan peace process, the negotiations, the difficulties, and all of the showmanship and the sort of the cosmetic posturing that we see. But I thought, at the end of the day, negotiations are better than no negotiations, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
But I totally concur with them. Sort of, it's looking very bleak, and obviously the Afghan government has its side of the blame for, from the beginning it wasn't keen on the peace process, like we both agree on. The Taliban also are very willing and keen to use violence, too willing rather to use violence to push forward their aims. But I think the axe sort of comes down to the Americans here on Biden for, completely senselessly going back on this agreement. But I want to sort of reorient towards the peace process itself. Now, we don't invite people onto our show because of their gender, their ethnicity, whatever. But you're a woman, and you're an Afghan woman, right? Of course. But it's often said that women's voices are not heard in the peace process, and Afghan women have not agreed to the peace process, or Afghan women will go back in the event of peace. Now, as an Afghan woman, right, what would you say? What differs a woman's perspective from a man's perspective? And is there any way in which women can practically be more influential in Afghanistan's politics? Indeed, do you even agree with this notion articulated as of most recent by Fawzia Kufi, that it's a women's issue and whatever? How would you go about articulating this? Because I know you said that you don't really listen to what non-Afghans say, and I think that's a wise, sound policy I'm going to start enacting myself. But this is once again the recurring anthem. Women, we can't have peace because some woman who owns a coffee cafe and Chardonnay won't be able to go date someone. It's a very prominent kind of thing.
Well, look, I think the current conversation about what Afghan women and girls can and cannot do is very superficial. I think this is part of the problem. First of all, again, this is one of those instances where I'm very conscious that I don't live the reality that women who live in Afghanistan have to live. And I don't have skin in the game, right? Because I have a preferred way to live, right? I'd like to think that other people would enjoy the same amount of agency and freedom that I have. And I come from a family of 3 sisters, and my parents never treated us less because we weren't boys, and they emphasized our education and our professional success, and we're not parents who are like, go get married, And so I had a great deal. Those were all privileges, and I'm very thankful for that. I think that when we talk about the lives of Afghan girls and women, we're trying to get to a situation whereby they can exercise agency to determine the course of their own lives. Now, how are you going to get to that point when 80% of Afghan women and girls are illiterate?
Exactly.
The thing is, I'm dead serious. Like there are hierarchies and stages to the development of kind of the complexities of society and how you make them less unequal. And I'm firmly of the belief that if something is happening that affects the lives of women or affects the lives of women and girls, they have a right to be part of that conversation. So yes, Afghan women and girls absolutely have a right to be a conversation about their country's future. How? So how? Let's ask that question. My preference would be to say that we need to build like a conscious Afghan government would make it its business to provide safety and security to men and women, to boys and girls, to ensure equal education for boys and girls, and to improve access to employment. Like women in Afghanistan work, the majority of Afghan women who work in the agricultural sector, and it's largely labor that's not recorded, right? It's sort of off the books, it's informal labor because it's subsistence farming. But women are working, right? And their labor is usually invisible. So, I don't disagree with Khanum Kufi. I absolutely think as many women as possible should be, but who are you telling? Like, you want to tell the Taliban to bring some women into their negotiating team? I mean, I think that's a great idea, but go tell them that.
That's was actually suggested. That in the last year, I've seen that being suggested several times. Look, the Republican team has so many women. Your team doesn't have any. So that was one of the criticism. But you said something very important. You said that a lot of women do work in rural Afghanistan, but because it's subsistence farming, it's not being recorded as labor. This is something I have tried to bring up numerous times on the podcast, and I will do it once again, if you don't mind. Afghanistan is a pre-modern country. It means that Afghanistan's economy, Afghanistan's way of doing trade, working, everything is still in a way that is that cannot be understood from a postmodern prism. So the fact that women don't have a paid job where they go in the morning on their bicycle, like here in the Netherlands, to do their job and then work in an office, send emails, and then go back home, that doesn't exist in most part of Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean that that should be the measure of how many women are working, because I am from a village about 15 kilometers away from the city of Kabul. And, in our village, we have we make fun of the fact that a lot of manual jobs that are done inside the house are done by women, like painting and fixing small things. And people in our village, they make fun of the fact that our women are like, they fix things that are often considered as typical men's jobs in other parts. But it means that in rural Afghanistan, society has not evolved for the past 300 years. So the roles of men and women, how it's divided, can be interpreted as very oppressive and whatnot. And the solution is not to measure those circumstances against criteria that are applicable for Western countries. So if you want to have an improved and a better life for women, with children, and men as well in Afghanistan, the progress needs to incorporate all these factors. And in my opinion, it's not being incorporated. It's just what fits the narrative in Western media, what's really punchy and very catchy to say, like, oh, so many women in Afghanistan are oppressed and this and that, but there is no practical solution. The solution is not to just open a lot of schools in Kabul and yoga clubs for women and then say, look, this is progress. It doesn't incorporate what is happening for the 70% of the rest of the country. So we have to accept that some progress has been made in the last 20 years. A lot of women have benefited from education, and these women, they have a say, they have a voice. they should be very vocal about what they think and what they feel, and we should all listen to each Afghan and every Afghan. I think we spoke about this before when you said yes, but the diaspora shouldn't also be just dismissed. Yeah, the diaspora have also something to say, but we need to have honest conversations, but we also have to move beyond these political and very, in my opinion, very impractical ways of defining our own problems. Whether it's inequality, whether it's lack of development, it needs to be based more on facts and less on scoring points and making sure that your own political, narrative prevails over others. And in my opinion, that seems to be one of the problems. And I always tend to be very reluctant to talk about women's rights and women's issues, because I feel like I don't want to be trapped into paying lip service to women's issues when I'm very skeptical about a lot of these things. You see what I'm saying?
I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I think that there is a lot of bad faith in conversations about the rights of Afghan women. I don't know that, again, for people who have no skin in the game, if you're someone who lives in the US or Europe or whatever, first of all, what's it to you? I think that's my first question. What's it to you about what's going on with women and girls in Afghanistan? Like, why is it your concern? Sometimes I feel this way. But the other point is, I want to see an Afghanistan in my lifetime where women and girls and boys and men have safe, stable lives full of dignity, right? Like that's the Afghanistan that I want to see. In Afghanistan, as you have said, there are all kinds of women. There are women who are incredibly successful and very, very talented and who run their own businesses and who are doctors and lawyers and judges and all the rest of it. And then there are women who are, by virtue of circumstance, by virtue of forced displacement, by virtue of 40 years of war. And the thing is, here's the real point for me. It is disingenuous to say that you care about the rights of Afghan women, but to say that you don't want the war to stop. The war absolutely has to stop before we can get into the hard work of actually protecting and defending the rights of women, because all of the global statistics show that women and girls suffer more during wartime than men and boys. And I'm not discounting at all the total suffering of Afghanistan, because most of the battlefield fighting and deaths on the battlefield are men and boys. And I want them to stop dying as well, right? So no, I think there are a lot of the conversations about Afghan women or the rights of Afghan women are conversations that I'm not willing to engage in either, to be honest. I'll engage in that conversation with other Afghan women, but I don't really want to have that conversation with people who don't have any skin in the game and don't really have any way to change the reality. Like, I agree. I don't like the way that the Taliban treat women. I think it's terrible. I think it looks bad for Islam. It looks bad for Muslims. It's bad for Afghans. Whatever. Let's do the whole list. But I don't know how to change the Taliban's mindset or mentality, right? Do you just give it time? If the Taliban hadn't been fighting a war for 20 years, would their positions have become more moderate? I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. But I do know for a fact that the war has to stop, and there has to be enough safety and stability that people can send their daughters to school, so their daughters aren't illiterate, so their daughters can improve their own lives. Like, at the end of the day, I don't believe that anyone does anything for women and girls except for those women and girls themselves. They're going to have to be given the opportunities to find their own way. And yeah, I think that could we at a minimum protect this much, right? The right of girls to go to school. Let's just try and stick to that much. But again, if you can't enforce it, if you're in no position to enforce it, just complaining about it is not really, because you couldn't defeat the Taliban militarily. You couldn't change the way that they govern militarily. So the only other way to do it is to change their ideas, to change their mentality. That's a long-term process. But they're not going to do it when they're fighting a war either, right? War hardens people's opinions. It doesn't moderate them. And so I think that I think that the complexity of those social and political dynamics and how they've changed Afghan society, and just like you were saying, Waleed John, like Afghanistan feels like it's going backwards. It feels like it's going backward because we can't like confront these issues, and we don't have enough peace to actually tackle difficult systemic problems.
Yeah, and I think coming back to the point you made, Ray, sort of about girls' schools, about education, about attitudes and whatever. I think one of the problems that we have, and it's something that has a sort of a historical precedent as well, is that this war in being justified along these sorts of lines of we're going there to rescue Afghan women and women's education, and in some instances, let's say, like the 500 schools that just didn't exist. Now that the international forces are packing their bags, or at least I hope it looks like they are, and I hope so, those ideas that they came for are sort of ideas that most Afghans will get behind, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The rule of law, justice, women going to school. There's a very small minority of Afghans that will actually come out and say, no, we don't want those things. But because those sort of ideas have become associated with something that's very dark, that's been very bloody, they're tarnished. And that's why, when Sangar said, I don't want to come out and sort of talk about women's rights and whatever now, is because of the baggage that's associated with those ideas. If I came out, and these are things that I strongly believe, I'm sure you guys would agree with me, Afghanistan needs to modernize, okay? It's not an option, it needs to modernize. How it does so is a different question. Afghanistan needs to be reformed. Women's rights needs to be given priority in Afghanistan. These are sorts of things that they're absolute necessities if the country is to survive. And yet, if you come out and you say it in those terms, people are going to have all sorts of connotations with them. It's sort of the same thing when, Amanullah came back from Europe and spoke about reforming Afghanistan and whatever. Afghan leaders for decades afterwards were terrified of looking too reformist. Even we did a podcast on Dawood Khan, Musa Shafiq, these people were very cautious because of Amanullah. And now I'm sort of thinking, for how much longer are we going to have to be cautious before we start saying, okay, well, we do have a problem in X, Y, Z. We do need to fix these things. And I'm not saying that from the sort of the liberal internationalist perspective, or the, proponent of the liberal international order, where if a state isn't functioning properly, let's just go in, dismantle the government and, like you, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, here's your toolkit. There you go. There's your government. That, there's so many issues. There's so many consequences of this war that we're going to be facing for decades if we actually want to remedy society, because the international forces haven't fixed it. They've actually exacerbated it, and they've left Afghans with the baggage. So I mean, it's a bit of a
it's absolutely true. I mean, it's not. Do you think Afghans have a healthy perspective on what elections are and what elections mean? Do you think that that's gone well? Right now, the whole idea of elections are tainted. Isn't that excellent? Like, that's excellent, right?
Exactly. And it's something we did, like a poll once, and we sort of wrote an article about what Afghans want from a post post-peace government. And everyone said, oh, an Islamic government, an Islamic government, an Islamic government, right? And one of the points, I think Sangar tweeted this the other day, is like, when Afghans talk about Islamic government, the first thing they're not talking about is cutting off the hand of a thief or lashing people or whatever.
Right.
When they're talking about Islam, they're talking about justice as they see it, right? And that's something that's obviously been missing. And now, if we came along and we said, and this is once again something I believe, that the government of Afghanistan should represent the people of Afghanistan, and if that takes place in sort of a representative democratic exercise within a government that still represents the values of Afghanistan, I'm not opposed to it. But if I say that, it's like, oh, well, we already had that. What the hell have we had for the last 20 years? We had Karzai and we had Ashraf Ghani, and then we have John Kerry lifting Abdullah's hand and the whole fiasco, and then we have two inaugurations happening side by side. No, we don't want that again, right? And do Afghans want elections? Now, when the Taliban are on very solid footing, like you said, they've won politically as well. if they come out and they say we don't want democracy in Afghanistan, a very large number of Afghans are going to say, yeah, I can resonate with that. I back that totally, because the last 19 years of a democratic experiment, and it's Ramadan, I'm going to mind my language here, uh, has not been exemplary.
Yes.
No, it hasn't been, and I would, and unfortunately, that's a big sort of ideological wing for the Taliban themselves. But I think look, the 20th century was one of the most, if not the most violent century in human history. Certainly one of the top contenders. And most countries in parts of Asia and parts of Africa and parts of Latin America are still trying to recover from sort of the legacies of colonialism or slavery or what have you, right? Afghanistan's had 40 years of war. It'll need at least 40 years of peace, right, to start getting itself together. Is that a fair guess?
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
I would say that's a fair guess, that you're going to need at least 40 years up, because it's much easier and quicker to destroy things than to build them again. So we're going to need at least 40 years going that way. At some point, the Taliban are going to have to govern, right? They're going to have to come into power, and they're going to have to deliver. And I think in the past, they showed that they weren't that capable of it. They have to come and show that they're capable of it, and they have to come and show they're capable of it in a modern world. Now, I also happen to think that the Taliban don't fairly represent the interests of the Afghan people, given their backing and their origin. But that's a reality we just have to live with. Pakistan will play proxy politics in Afghanistan. It's just a fact of life. Pakistan won. By the way, the Pakistani intelligence are the other people who won the war. It was the Taliban and Pakistani intelligence. Those are the winners here. Everyone else is a loser, including all the people of Afghanistan. So I think we have to accept that there are realities that are going to take a long time to resolve. It's going to take a while, and I guarantee you, just as we saw in the Middle East over the course of the last decade, there will come a point that if your government behaves badly enough, and if the Taliban come back and they do it again, I don't think Afghans are going to stand for it this time around, right? And then perhaps you're going to start a new conversation domestically about what Afghanistan should look like. But I don't think that the Taliban currently are in a mood or really in a position to start changing any of the positions they've held for the last 20 years.
I think that the main problem, as you perfectly explained before, is that in a state of conflict, positions of people harden and they won't even accept any criticism. Like, for instance, I don't know if you noticed that. So there was a video going viral in Afghan social media of fighting in Baghlan, where you see Taliban inside a family's house. They're firing, launching rockets from people's home, and everybody was condemning that. And then I received a video of a similar situation where there is Afghan National Army stationed inside a family's house in Helmand, in Marja. And the children are sitting there and just they're watching how these guys in uniforms with their Humvees and mortars are in their in front yard in their house. So I made a video. I added these two images next to each other, and I tweeted that and showed people okay, this is what's happening. The government and the Taliban are doing exactly the same thing. They are using people's houses as shelter. And what you see is that I've been attacked from both sides. Taliban are saying, yeah, well, but what they are doing it as well. So you can't even have a conversation where you say this is immoral. You cannot go inside people's houses and do this. So because it's an environment of war and conflict, and people feel like they are under existential threat by the opposing side, they're not open for any kind of conversation. So most of the things that we have discussed in the last 1 hour and 30 minutes are things that are necessary. They need to be said. We need to have these discussions among Afghans, obviously, in Afghanistan, but also among the diaspora. But most of what we have so far discussed, in my opinion, will only be effective if there is peace. If there is no more fighting, we won't see any results. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
No, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think I've been making that case for at least 10 years that the war is itself the problem. The war itself has to stop. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
Fatima, it was a very enlightening conversation. While talking to you, I feel like we have talked before quite often before. Like there is so much overlap and there is so much,
Yeah, of course.
so I'm very happy to have you as our guest again in future, because we've just scratched the surface. There is so much to be discussed. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I just want to ask you, if our listeners and viewers would like to contact you, what is the best way for them to contact you?
I'm available publicly on Twitter, and my handle is @the_cynicist, so people can get in touch anytime. I'm really pleased to be here with Afghan Eye. These are great conversations. It always pleases me to talk with other Afghans and to see just new ideas and new conversations, because I think that you are absolutely right, Sangar, that we need to talk amongst ourselves a lot more.
Okay. I will add your Twitter handle in the description so people can contact you. I'm looking forward to your new article that's going to be published soon, inshallah.
Yes.
Okay, we will also share your new article. So, guys, everyone who was listening so far and watching, thank you very much. This is our 25th episode, so yet another milestone for the Afghan Eye. If you guys like our content, if you want us to continue, show your support. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment. Maybe we can have a conversation in the comment section. And for others who want to contribute, you can always become a patron or donate via PayPal. The links are there for all of you to see. Thanks again, Fatima, for being our guest, and I hope to see you soon again. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Wa alaikum
Okay.
salam.